Europe, each place has its own unique challenges. From vibrant city streets to quiet village squares, people experience the impact of economic and social changes in different ways. The ESPON Research Priority, Perspective for All People and Places, aims to help policymakers understand and support the places we call home, and create place-based policies. By mapping out the diversity of European territories, we bring new evidence to support policymakers in improving people's day-to-day lives in all aspects such as housing, employment opportunities, access to culture and public services. Together, we can build a more cohesive Europe, with a better perspective for all people and places.
Welcome everyone to our session on one of the most pressing issues facing Europe today, the housing affordability. Across the EU, rising housing costs are leaving more and more people struggling to make ends meet, exposing deep inequalities and threatening the goal of territorial cohesion. The shortage of affordable housing is a societal challenge that requires urgent and coordinated action. Over the past decades, housing costs have outpaced disposable incomes in most member states, pointing to a housing system that is increasingly under strain. But what lies at the heart of this dysfunction? Understanding these dynamics is critical to propose place-based measures to policymakers at different geographical levels. Research tells us that rent levels depend on the availability of housing units, household numbers, and income levels. Meanwhile, house prices are closely linked to disposable income, demographic shifts, and the cost of capital. Today, we'll dig deeper into those factors to uncover how policymakers can better anticipate and address the forces driving housing unaffordability. Together, we aim to tackle some key questions. What are the root causes of Europe's housing crisis? How can we design and implement policies that not only mitigate these challenges, but also promote sustainable and inclusive territorial development? And most importantly, how can we ensure that housing, a basic human need, is accessible for all? This session is not just about identifying problems. It's about discussing actionable, forward-thinking ideas that can enhance quality of life across Europe. Together, we'll reflect on the evidence produced and being developed by the ESPON Housing for All project, as well as the European Commission's efforts to create new evidence and support policies aimed at delivering more affordable housing to European residents. This will be a dynamic, talk show-style conversation designed to engage not only those in the room, but also you. So we are kindly inviting you to use Slido, propose questions already, and upvote the ones you find the most interesting. We'll make sure to use them. I will now, as your moderator, briefly introduce our distinguished panelists for this session. They are going to bring a wealth of expertise and diverse perspectives to the discussion, and I'm confident their insights will inspire a meaningful discussion and actionable ideas as we tackle the pressing issue of housing affordability across Europe. Let's meet them. Franziska Silke, full professor of urban and regional research at the Institute of Spatial Planning at the Technical University of Vienna and an affiliated professor at the Department of Land Economy, University of Cambridge. She has specialized in European comparative spatial and policy analysis and is the lead partner of the ESPON Housing for All project. Welcome.
Thank you.
Alice Fittini, research director at Housing Europe, the European Federation of Public, Cooperative and Social Housing. With over 10 years of professional experience in social and affordable housing, Alice is leading Housing Europe Observatory, and she's in charge of providing strategic advice to Housing Europe policy work and devising studies, including the biannual report, The State of Housing in the European Union, also working on the ESPON Housing for All project. Welcome.
Thank you.
And Stefan Zeugner, who became an economist in Vienna and has a PhD from the European Center for Advanced Research in Economics and Statistics at ULB Brussels. He joined Directorate General for Economic and Financial Affairs of the European Commission in 2011 and is currently Deputy Head of its Unit for Macroeconomic Imbalances. His current research focuses on the empirics of European housing markets, as well as cross-border and domestic financial flows in particular, along with benchmarking house prices and private sector credit. Welcome. To kick off our session, we'll begin with a first round of questions directed to our distinguishable guests. Following their responses, we'll open the floor to your questions from Slido. Please feel free to start submitting them already, and as I've already mentioned, we'll pick the most interesting ones. Ms. Ilke, starting off with you, how does the housing offer in Europe look like? What are the differences in affordability across Europe?
Yeah, thank you very much. As you've already mentioned, housing has nowadays become a topic where every citizen speaks about it, and it seems to now have really met the policy world with a very strong and fast force now, with the new housing commissioner even coming in at the European level. And what we can see is that we had the opportunity in this Espon House for All project to cover some evidence, specifically in terms of what is on offer, what do we have currently on the market in terms of housing, both for sales, so what can I buy, and then also what can I rent. And the way that we did this is through some web scraping, and I believe we even have some evidence here. So I'm gonna start the presentation. Oh, I'm sorry, I think this was already for the introduction of us. And we are going directly into some of the evidence. What we did in this project is that we started our empirical work with the question, as I said, what the housing offer actually does look like. And the way that we approached it is through some web scraping exercise, so that we took the opportunity of our new technological advances and covered for the full of Europe, so for all 31 countries within the Espon space, an exercise where we scrap on web pages what exactly is the housing offer. And that does mean that we have the information about the prices, we have where it is located in Europe, where it is located on a street level, sometimes even a little bit more, and we can actually say what the rooms are, what is the quality of the housing, as to the extent that it is mentioned on any kind of advertisement. So, and by having had the opportunity to have this across Europe, we can now start to analyze the data. What I'm going to show now is two maps, as you can see already, where we put this data together via each country, and you can see on the legend to the left, so I'm an academic, so I'm going to push you a little bit to go with me through the maps, is that we have a comparable legend to both of the graphics, so we can, in this case at least, see what the prices in absolute terms are. So these maps represent the sales mean prices, so on average via LAU2 units. This is a European, let's say, statistical unit, which is comparable more or less across the full of Europe. And what we can see is some quite interesting trends that we kind of know, right? This is a public speak, but what we do at the moment is really cover the evidence of how substantial these problems are. So if you look at France, we know, everyone across Europe knows that doing holidays on the French coast is quite a nice experience.
Indeed.
And we can now see this in these slides, to what extent that is really impacting on the house prices. And if you look really at the coastal regions, both the Atlantic as well as the Mediterranean coast, and you look, for example, into how dark red we get, we can see what the touristic areas are, and the secondary housing questions come into those aspects as well. And of course, then we've got some urban centers, but also some greener areas in the center of France, where actually we, in some cases, have really low house prices. And I know we always talk about affordability as a problem in terms of where we have the hot areas, we have Stockholm, we have Paris, we have the coast, but we also have some areas where, due to an over offer of housing, we have actually substantial problems for those that want to sell to get a fair value for their houses. So we should look at those in terms of the housing market as well. And if you look at Sweden, this is a bit bigger units, but we can see then in the mountainous areas, but also specifically in some of the urban areas, such as Stockholm, we have the highest prices. So at first, it doesn't bring us a lot of surprises. But what we then look into in the next step is really how difficult this is, and going into a really low-level local analysis of exactly those cities, so we can see where in the cities what type of housing markets are being thought after. So now I've brought you a map for sales and rents, and so where we've got the empty spaces to the right on the map, where there's the rent map, that is not because we don't have any scrappings there. There is renting, but it is not in a sizable number that we at this point already feel that this is a representative offer. As we are scrapping for the full period of a whole year, we hope to be able to fill this map by the end of the exercise. But what becomes then quite interesting is that we already can see the differences in terms of where prices are higher. This is quite comparable. But the regions where in comparable as terms, renting is much cheaper is already in the countryside, whereas sales prices, at least in Germany, you can see that the south of Germany is quite expensive, whereas in the renting sector, it's really in specific areas. So when we talk about policies, and I think we come to this today, we have to really look specifically into what the problem set is where, and if we develop a policy, it will not have the same effect in every territory of the European Union. Now enough, we move a little bit away from maps, though we have got much more, and we are developing them now in relation to actually income as well. I want to show you and give you an idea of what we can take away from a European-wide comparison. What we've developed here is so-called violin charts, where we have taken this housing offer and we harmonized them. And the gray area that you see in each of those little graphs is the European average. And now harmonizing those income prices, what we can see is where the price distribution is, what is on offer in the market. And you can see, for example, in the case of Poland, that we've got at the lower end, so the cheapest housing market, we have some offer. But directly and immediately then, there comes this gap. And that is the type of housing offer that, of course, we need in terms of affordable housing. That is very much thought after. But of course, there we can see that maybe that is, which is at the very bottom, that is the type of housing offer which maybe doesn't have the right quality. And we can see this on average in many countries. And interestingly, what we see is that the housing offer across Europe is very different. Again, if we now speak about what we can do for affordability, the way that housing markets work differs substantially across countries. So if you take, for example, the case of Sweden, we have some offer that is already at the lower end of the affordability. Now we take one more these graphs for renting and sales for Germany, where you've already seen the map. And what we can see here is that what we also kind of assumed, but now we've got the evidence for most of the countries, that the renting sector operates substantially different, and where we have in different countries lower averages, whereas the sales prices are much higher. So in terms of accessibility to housing, we can already see that from the majority of the population, renting is affordable. Buying into the housing market, something that traditional many markets in Europe have, and which, for example, in Eastern Europe is by many countries really thought after, becomes even more a burden. And just what I wanted to bring as a last example is the violin chart as well for Romania, where you can see, yes, there is a stock offer, there is an offer which is at the lower end of the income rate, but then for a very long period, there's no offer. And that is really what is targeted towards the middle income. And there is very little offer available. And then, of course, it comes again when there is a little bit more to pay. Having this in mind, what we can learn is that for each European country, it's first of all, the housing offer is very different, but also then where the challenges are for individuals to get into the housing market and maybe, as you said, live with the right quality is quite different across Europe. And I assume we will go into this in a little bit more detail now.
Thank you very much. From the violins that quite nicely depict the current situation to policy aspects that differ regarding location, but they have evolved during the time, right, as well, Ms. Bettini?
Sure. Thank you very much. So as mentioned before, as Housing Europe, we're involved in the House for All project, which we're very, very happy about. And we are more specifically looking into comparing trends and comparing the framework when it comes to housing policies across Europe. And I have to say, we learned through this project, and we confirmed in a way what we knew already, that to talk about housing policies and to really try to pinpoint which policies, what does it mean, policies for affordable housing, and especially trying to assess them also in quantitative terms is really something very, very tricky and very, very difficult. So I thought for today what could be useful would be to start with with few elements which can help us basically assessing what's been going on in terms of housing policies over the last years. And I think the main point that I wanted to raise is that housing policies have not been an area of policy where government have been most active over the recent decades, especially since the 1990s until recently. But this is likely, and it's already changing at the national and local level in many places across Europe because of the urgency of the housing problem that people are facing. So the first chart that I wanted to show you is about the actual share of social housing in Europe. This is something that we monitor constantly over time. And I think it's quite interesting because many people don't really know what the sector is and how large it is. So, and this is also due to the fact there is a huge diversity across Europe. So what we see is that in some countries, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, there's very little or virtually no social housing, partly or mainly as a consequence of historical trends, including the fact that the political transition and economic transition in these countries from socialism was accompanied by massive privatization of the housing stock. Then you have a group of countries which we can say are more located in the Mediterranean or Southern European region that also have a small social housing sector, but this is also due to the fact that these countries over time have mainly favored owner occupation as a solution for their population. At the same time, the sector is still very much alive and kicking and quite large in some countries, especially in Western Europe. Countries like Austria, Denmark, the Netherlands have a large social housing sector that has basically lived up the test of time and is still housing a large proportion of the population today. In Denmark, you can think 1 out of 6 people lives in not-for-profit housing, and you would find similar shares in some of the countries mentioned here. Also important to highlight, we often use terms like affordable housing, social housing, and we try to put different things into the same box. We have to keep in mind that social housing is organized very differently across all these countries, ranging from public housing provision to working with not-for-profit, limited-profit housing companies. And sometimes you have different schemes living together within the same country. So this is just to highlight once again the complexity that we're trying to deal with. Given this context, I also wanted to give another set of interesting data, I think. This is from Eurostat public accounts, so the COFOG database that looks at the different areas of spending by governments across Europe. And by government, I mean all level of government, from the national to the local level. And what we can see over the last decade, but if we go back in time a bit more, I think the trend would be even sharper, is that housing policies have tended to focus more and more on supporting people, helping them to pay the rents that they cannot cope with, rather than investing in the supply of affordable and social housing over time. So I think these are two aspects to keep in mind. Of course, especially on this aspect, it's very hard to compare data across countries, but it still gives a strong indication of where housing policies have been going. But also maybe on where they're going next, because as you can see, over the past few years, faced with a lack of supply of housing construction overall and of affordable housing, especially many countries have started to react. And maybe on this I will leave the floor for the...
Thank you very much. We can very much see how the situation differs in different countries and regions as well. And it's connected to so many factors, like history you've mentioned as well. Of course, the government spending is a crucial one here. But let's try to grasp a bigger picture when it comes to housing affordability from a macroeconomic perspective. Mr. Zagner, what are the key drivers that have brought about this situation?
Thank you. There is a very important geographical dimension. One of it is that historically we're in a very dense continent. So the prices that we Europeans face for centuries are much higher than prices that Americans face, and still are. So there is an important geographical dimension, but over the past 20 years, there's a very important time dimension too. And I'll tell you why, from the European Commission perspective, we've been following this over the time dimension already for some time. It might not have been as public as the Commission makes it now, but housing markets are a very important part of investment and a very important part of macroeconomies and also of the stability of economy. When you remember in 2008, 9, 10, we had a lot of crises in Europe, and many of these crises were related not to initial government debt issues or whatever, but to booming housing markets that led to construction in places where it was not needed. And then the stop of this construction basically pushed the countries into crisis, right? So it is from that where this macroeconomic imbalance procedure was started by the Commission, which added to the whole macroprudential framework on the banking side, right? Macroprudential is basically making sure that housing markets do not make banking systems collapse. And macroeconomic imbalance surveillance and macroeconomic surveillance should ensure that housing markets interactions do not make macroeconomies or economies collapse. There is an additional element though, it's not only macroeconomic stability, it's imbalances, right? And the housing markets, if housing markets become imbalanced, as we see in many places nowadays, this has a lot of implications for, perhaps not for stability, but for the whole productivity and the potential of European families to develop, right? But when we take a step back and we look back at the last 1.5 decades, right? I talked about this big crisis in 2008, 9, 10, right? That also affected a lot of member states that just came into the European Union back then. When we take a snapshot after that, you had incomes of households recovering from about 2010 onwards, overall, not everywhere, but overall, and that's the yellow line in this chart. Okay, you see here in the yellow line, incomes of households have been only growing slowly in the previous decade. Then there was a COVID shock, and then they've been growing more quickly, right? Much of this, though, is inflation, right? And then the house price side, you saw house prices coming down in most places, except Germany, basically, after the financial crisis until 2014. Then you had a turning point, and house prices started to grow everywhere. And house prices in COVID didn't slump. They accelerated, right? What we have since 2022, we have an adjustment of house prices, but it's quite temporary. What you see in the dotted lines here is the spring forecast of the European Commission on house prices and on incomes. We just released the autumn forecast. It doesn't look as good as it is here. It looks more like this. So we do not expect the fundamental drivers of house prices to have changed very much from the pre-COVID time. The temporary respite that we see here is basically the interest rate impact. So the interest rate increases impacted house prices a lot, which means that house prices came down, but that doesn't mean that housing became more affordable, because you have to pay more for your mortgage now than you had, even if the price of the house that you try to purchase is lower, right? Same for the rents. So rental data and statistics, the quality is not very comparable, so I don't show them here. But what we know in terms of rental affordability has not improved much either. The drivers are that we have here demand, right? Demand partially from interest rates, but mainly from household incomes, and mainly from households trying to move to places where supply is limited and has been limited before. Supply was less limited in Madrid when lots of people moved there. Supply is very limited in the cities where people tried to move in the last 15 decades. And so the interest rates are discussed, right? I'll not discuss this any further, and I said that the regional dimension matters. What you see here in the blue is the metro regions of the capital of the countries that you see here. So the capital regions like Warsaw, Berlin, Madrid, Paris, and so on. That's the prices in the capitals, and in yellow you see the other regions, right? many of which are also cities. Now what we see is that price pressure on housing since about 2017-18 has become an issue everywhere, including in almost all of the countryside except in the green bits of the maps that you had showed before. So basically, we're talking here about 80% of the population of Europe that is affected by this increase very strongly. But in the big cities, it is the biggest problem. And the big cities are the ones that create the productivity and the resources with which we fund our well-being, right? Any person that cannot move to a big city that's very productive is a problem for productivity, right? It's a problem for state resources. I talked about the drive for limited supply. What we see in Europe in the past is we had residential investment that, was hit by the great financial crisis but recovered. But what has not recovered is our completion of new dwellings. We are making far fewer new apartments than we had been making even pre-COVID. And pre-COVID, we are making far fewer new apartments than we had done until 2008. And that is visible. Now you have much more investment in renovation, which is necessary, right? But the investment in new construction is much more limited and much tighter. I'm just on the previous slide, I had also again why we care. So it's there are three things. One is, well-being of families, right? That's a pure social consideration, which is very important. Another one is that productivity of countries really is affected by the lack of supply and the people not being able to move to where they are most productive. And the third is we have ever more evidence, and pretty good empirical evidence by now, that fertility is also affected by high house prices. The reason why we have no kids is because the first birth of women is coming ever later, and this is apparently related to it being very difficult for families to find living space.
Yeah, housing is very much connected to the social segment of our lives. Moving on to your questions, we have quite a few coming in from Slido, but I think we might go with this one. What could the European Union do to help us? I'm quite curious as well to hear more about the EU's ways of helping us regarding this. So we've heard about the problems, the situation. What could the EU do to help? Anybody from our speakers, maybe?
I'm happy to start.
Sure.
I think it's a particularly interesting and exciting time for when it comes to housing from the Brussels perspective. So for many years, we've known that different areas of policy and regulation at European level do have an impact on housing in different ways. But I think it's never been clearer than today. So we have for the first time a commissioner who has housing as part of his portfolio, in addition to energy. And the Commission has announced affordable housing plan that is basically in the pipeline and will be, they will start working on it very soon. And it will be also accompanied by an investment platform involving the European Investment Bank and other funding institutions to make sure that the necessary funding goes to the sector. And I think there are, in this context, of course, many things that can help, but I wanted to raise just 2 points. So first of all, I would say consistency across the policy areas within the EU competencies is very important. So making sure that, for instance, environmental energy policies are also assessed from the point of view of the help and but also the impact they can have on housing affordability. And for this, strong coordination within the institution, the different departments, is very important, I would say. And the second point is about the funding. It's, of course, a very welcome news that there will be a platform basically channeling funding to the sector. So far, what we've seen is that, first of all, EU funding is often said or considered to be just a drop in the ocean compared to the huge need for investment that is needed within the sector. At the same time, I would say it has also shown that that it has huge potential, and especially when it comes to Next Generation EU funding, for some countries like Spain, Portugal, the possibility to use this funding for affordable housing has really given a huge boost to the sector. So the question remains what will happen over the next years. So keep affordability and sustainability over the long term as the key guiding principles.
Thank you very much. Moving on to the next one, we are going to take one more question from our audience. What are the similar challenges across European countries? Does anybody want to take take this one? Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think that relates to what Alicia already said as regards to the question what the European Union can do, is we've got very similar challenges according to types of territories. We said already that a lot of the coastal regions are experiencing substantial pressure in terms of secondary housing, touristification. Some of the more rural regions in Europe are actually experience shrinkage, maybe a topic that does not affect the breadth of the society, but for large part of the regions having an undervalued housing market and experiencing shrinkage actually accelerates shrinkage tendencies. So I think that's maybe something where the European Union can already help support, identify what those regions are, bring them together as well. And then, of course, for the particular challenges we find is the European Union has a substantial knowledge base already, both in terms of where population growth is happening, so where do we experience continued urban growth, but also in which countries do we have continued urbanization processes. And we can quite nicely already understand where the pressures will increase. And that is where the value actually is then linked to the substantial amount of budget that is existing at the European Union level, and the plans going into the next multi-annual financial framework is to really make use of this knowledge. And I think in terms of specifically housing, what we can see right now is that there is quite a substantial effort to bring the breadth of knowledge that is out there together. That's of course all the detailed work that you're doing already from the macroeconomics work. The European Investment Bank has a lot of knowledge there. The OECD, maybe not for every European country, but there's so much knowledge on the different drivers and factors that actually impact what exactly is going out of your pocket into housing that is starting to be put together. And that maybe would be something, if we match this together with those specific challenges we see, we can really target policies. Just to give one precise example from the data that we have, and that's obviously not something that you can see in these national maps, but if we really go at the local level, we can understand by the fact of how long one advertisement is online, which of those parts of the market are being sought after. So we see this turnaround. And we have, in observing this over a certain period of time, we exactly know what is the market segment that is missing. And that's something that a local real estate agent would know from experience. But we can have this information and much more targetedly create the housing offer. And if we talk about what type of dwellings should be finalized, there is a specific relationship between the private investments and where the housing offer that is being created stems from particular money going into the sector that of course is doing this for profit purposes, and the segment where, as a politician, if you want to do something around affordability, maybe you would like to also increase the number of other types of dwellings. And bringing this together, I think this is a European question, and offering not just directly maybe budgetary consequences and offers for European member states, but also helping in the knowledge exchange, because ultimately we are discussing about the European Union level. The biggest similar challenge I see, and then I'm coming to a close with the statement, is that there is limited resources at the local level, and that is where we are creating the housing offer. This is where planning systems are coming into the game, where we have regulatory frameworks, and where local authorities are substantially challenged at the moment. And this is where a knowledge exchange across countries in terms of how to get on the path of creating affordable and social housing can help. And I mean, I'm currently working in Vienna, and Vienna has always been asked, why don't we roll out the Viennese model across the European Union? It seems to be successful. It's not that easy, but starting and creating, consciously thinking about the path that we want to be, where do we want to be in 20, 30 years, we need to start now.
Yeah, better sooner than later. I hope you are happy with the answers from our speakers. We'll be back to another set of questions from the public as well. But let me just remind you about the survey that we have prepared for you. The information is going to be very, very much useful for us. So please fill out the survey whenever you find the time during the session. We'll come back to your questions. There's quite a few very interesting ones. Moving on with you, Mr. Zangner. So much knowledge, so much information, but what policy instruments do we have to address the information, in particular when public funds are scarce?
The problem is there are so many of them, and they are distributed over so many different levels, and all of them are interlocking. And that is precisely, it's a big coordination issue. Also the information on, like what you just mentioned, on information on where we need the houses. You show the map of France, which has fantastic data on the local level. And then you show the map of Germany, which doesn't have fantastic data at all, when you look at it from a statistical perspective. We are lacking statistical data a lot. So the other map that I showed is actually, we try to track housing stocks over time on a local level. It is very difficult to do that. We are lacking definitions of social housings. So if you were to channel private funds to social housing or affordable housing projects, you first need a definition to what it is. Otherwise, you cannot give a guarantee from a public bank. So there is a lot of work that still needs to be done. Completed dwellings, we're talking about this, but there's not even, Eurostat is working on this, but there's not even a statistic on this yet on the European level. So we have a lot of knowledge, but we have very little harmonized knowledge, and we have a lot of policy ideas, but there is very little, so far, relatively little assessment how important these are. Now, let's talk about the levels about these policy things. Now, what is an assessment that we totally share is that there has been much more fiscal resources going into demand support rather than supply support. Supply support, the construction of social housing, but also building subsidies, these kind of things has been pared back a lot over the last 20 years, and actually much more focus is on the demand support, in particular for the low income actually. But this is not the most costly bit. In many countries, the most costly bit is the support to mortgages by rich people to purchase a lot of square meters, right? And this is fiscally much more costly, and it basically crowds out the lower incomes and provides big square meters, a lot of square meters to the richer strata. I mean, the country with the biggest apartments is Netherlands, which has one of the biggest subsidies like this, this kind of policies is not the European policy. It's not for us to force the countries to. This is tax policy. This is local policy. I mean, it's for the countries to implement. However, this has implications for their macroeconomy, and therefore implications if the country is large enough for the macroeconomy of others. So the Commission and the Council together are giving economic recommendations to countries. And so far, the focus was that we would focus on recommendations that would reduce demand, in particular demand for many square meters. And there's also some recommendations recently have been brought. Portugal is one example, and also some new funds like this Recovery and Resilience funds that were put into providing social housing. The problem is, and that you highlight as well, it is a drop in the ocean. I mean, taking directly European funds right now into social housing, we have so far funded less than $1 billion, I think, of social housing. If you exclude this one Spanish, if you exclude the Recovery Resilience Fund in Spain, we plan to spend much more in housing, right? But just identifying projects, getting through the planning, this is extremely complicated. A much more impactful avenue for using European funds to fund housing is the EIB component that is also in the Affordable Housing Plan, where the EIB and other public banks will provide guarantees such that private money could go into affordable housing, because we have a lot of institutional investors that often invest your own pension, right? The Swedish pension fund for everybody, right? The pension funds of the Netherlands and in Germany, whatever. They are looking for stable returns that are not high, but stable. So they require guarantees. So providing these guarantees is one way where you could actually allow municipalities, so the public sector, but also private providers, non-profit providers, to provide housing more easily. But again, we come back to the first thing, we lack the harmonized definitions. So there's a lot of work over the next 12 months, I'd say, before you will see any concrete action. And that is a big problem, right? We are very late with doing something, and we now need to spend more time on little paperwork in order to get something going. And that is the biggest challenge we face. Now, there is one other aspect, that is the regulation of in particular energy efficiency. There have been, even for the first energy building directive, there has been an impact assessment on housing affordability. I remember because I criticized it back then, but there has been one. So the Commission is aware of the fact that requiring ever more stringent insulation and so on when you renovate your apartment, let's say, or when you build a new one, adds to the cost. But we have a problem here again with different countries. We have gold plating in different countries that add extra requirements, which then makes it difficult for suppliers from other countries to provide those. We have a lot of red tape where, you as a municipality, you would require an architect or an engineer that you don't have to assess 1,000 things, and you cannot hire an architect or engineer from Spain because there is no standardization of this red tape either. So we have a lot of problems in the regulation, and finally we have a lot of investment needs for energy efficiency as well. So we need to invest in providing more square meters to people, but we also need to invest to make the housing stock carbon free. So the investment demand is huge. In Europe, we always talk about how huge our investment gaps are, but there's very little in the statistics that shows that we address it. And the question is here, what levers can we find to address those? And the money that is available is not a lot.
Thank you very much for our speakers and for you, our dear audience. Just to let you know, you watching us are mostly working for a regional public body responsible for designing, implementing public policies. And on the second place, we've got private for-profit, consultant private research organization. And on the third place, a European public body responsible for designing, implementing public policies. So our audience very much is aware of the issues out there. But moving on, you've mentioned quite a few areas in need of improvement, Mr. Zeigner. But Ms. Bettini, do you see any other recent or emerging area for policymakers to focus on?
So first of all, let me start by just picking up on this last point on energy. I think this is definitely an area where we see more and more an overlap between environmental energy policies and the housing policies. EU, without any doubt, has also been a strong driver in this. And I think it's necessary. We've seen, for example, the latest data on the indicators around energy poverty show really sharp increases. We're talking about 47 million people in a situation of not being able to keep their homes warm. A huge increase over the past few years, also given the increase in energy prices and the overall inflation. So, of course, this is very important, but we have very different starting points across Europe in terms of the quality of the stock, of the energy management, and so on. So this is something that is really key to keep in mind. But if I have to really think of what was not on the agenda of housing policies, let's say 10 years ago, I think we see several changes. One of them is definitely the topic of tourist lettings or short-term lettings. This is something which was really not part of the plan, let's put it like that, for local and national politicians working on housing in the past, but it's become a huge factor that we really have to factor in and keep in mind when we discuss the potential and the room for maneuver of local authorities. I just give you one example because I've heard of it just the other day from a study of the La Sapienza University in Rome. So in Rome there are at the moment over 30,000 Airbnb short-term lettings advertised on the market, and the number of apartments for rent on the main rental online platform is less than 2,000. So we're really talking. What are we talking about if this is the situation, and what can be done at the national, local level to work around this topic? Of course, without blindly wanting to neglect the positive aspects that this can have. But of course, it's really a big elephant in the room, I would say. Another point that I wanted to raise. And we've really seen it quite clearly working on the ESPON project, is the stronger interlink between social policies, but in particularly policies related to homelessness and the housing policies. So I think historically these were seen somehow as two different policy areas, but it's less and less so, probably also due to the fact that in many countries homelessness seems to be much more closely related with trends on, in terms of housing costs on the housing market. So you have families who are homeless because they cannot afford the cost of housing. And therefore, we see more and more homelessness strategies that tend to take a housing-led approach, so a stronger connection there. I will maybe stop here for the time being, and there might be something more coming from the questions from the audience.
There's quite a few questions online, but first off, I've got one more for you, Ms. Ilka. How will you take the Housing for All project forward? Some solutions may be found in it as well, right?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, we work around three main work streams. One is the web scrapping, and I'm maybe reacting to one of the questions there already around whether the maps presented today are going to be offered if their access will be given to it and the related data. So what we are doing right now is that we will finalize the web scrapping exercise until April, so that we really scratch for a full year and really can see a full year cycle, because of course the movement in the housing market also differs via seasons. Yes, then this data will be made available through ESPON, and this will also be published. Importantly, what our next step there will be is link it to affordability. This is what we're doing right now, is that we work with income data at LAU2 level, again at a very lower granularity, because if I, for example, live in London, I get a higher salary than if I live in, I don't know, let's say Brighton, right? So already the income levels differ. So if we really want to know what affordability is, we need to match income levels with the house prices. This is what we are doing right now, and it is, stay tuned for the results, because it's really interesting to see the differences in country, and it also differs what our income proxy will be. What we always say quite often is that we need more information on housing, and I'm really thankful for what you said, for example, around dwellings that are finalized and that are being built, that we need those information. But also we need income data at a lower level to actually be able to say something around what affordability means, and what available disposable income is existing. And I know there's a lot of work going on in this direction. We are currently working as well with the French study and data that we are amending for the whole of Europe, and actually understanding what affordability is. And then we can see quite a lot of differences depending on the income data we get. That analysis will be made available in spring next year. And what we also are doing importantly is that we now go into the case study work, and we also have finalized the housing compendium that was led by Alice, and which we are currently just proofreading. So hopefully it will be online also early next year. That should hopefully help to really get an understanding what does housing policy mean? You know, it's a term we use, housing policies. I have no idea what housing policies is, and I've done years of research on it. The reason is that all kinds of policy fit into what housing prices ultimately end up being. And we've talked, for example, about benefits policies, that is the support that you've as well shown. Sorry, it was you, Alice. To help individuals to get a specific support in paying or getting access to specific housing. And then there is energy policies does substantially impact on house prices. The planning aspect, so where do we plan and do we aim for a more compact city? So does it mean that all cities in Europe suddenly think about adding 1 or 2 or 3 more levels? So there's a lot of different types of policies that need to come together. And what we did in the compendium is to try, we don't promise it's comprehensive because it's really complicated, but at least go through every ESPON country, even beyond the ESPON countries, to try to bring this information together. And also look, as you already said, that there's no definition on social housing, but we try to go back to the national definition. So what is the understanding that national, let's say, policy regimes have operated under so far? And this is what we will be publishing, and we hope that that already at the European level comes at a timely point in time to really have an opportunity to get an overview. What do countries already do? There's a lot happening, but then also see how that fits together with specific expectations by society, which differ. There are countries in Europe where there's a culture where renting is socially totally acceptable, but we have countries within the European Union where one of the really genuine life goals of citizens is to acquire property.
Yeah.
And we need to be aware of those differences. And then finally and importantly, we are working on individual case studies at the moment where we both try to, for example, look across shrinkage regions in Europe, but also then really look into these pressing matters in the urban core, where we really go into specific policy measures that have been taken. We will, for example, look at a Finnish case where we look around the implications of changed regulations for landlords. And we also have a little bit of a project with one of my brilliant employees, Selim Banabak, where we just, for example, looked at the short-term rental regulation that has just been passed in Vienna, and it was one of the regulations. So we try to really see what's happening in individual regulations and how these are actually impacting. For example, I have to say, I'm very sorry, our initial data, linking it to the web scrapping data and the different short-term rental offer data, shows even though the regulation came into force, there's no change. We don't have an addition to the housing market. We don't have an increase in offer in the renting sector. So that also shows us we need to really closely look into what type of regulation is being developed, and then making sure that we find regulations that are impactful with the overall goals that politicians have set themselves.
Thank you very much. Let me just kindly remind our audience to fill in the survey online on Slido. The information will be used internally just to let us better understand our audience. Moving on to your questions, an environmental one. How can we increase housing supply without negatively affecting the environment and respect no net land take objectives? Anyone you want to take? Mr. Sogna?
So the biggest challenge is to increase housing supplies in the big cities. Or in dense areas, right? And here we're really discussing, we have an issue from a climate perspective in order to limit the use of land. So the big question is how we can do better use of brownfield development in order to build. And here is where the investment that is not in housing comes in. You have, so we have two types of big potentials for brownfield developments in the big cities. One is old suburbs. They could be developed with mid-rises, but they require schools, they require sewage systems, they require public transport that should be much better and so on. So there's a lot of public investment that would go in connecting old outside neighborhoods much better to the central cores of the cities. And the other issue that we face is old industrial sites, which require immense resources, financial resources to develop. Prague is a good example where you have private investors trying to buy old manufacturing sites and redeveloping them, motivated by what? By huge house prices, right? That's a bit the problem. So there is some kind of market failure because it's really, really hard to get an old industrial site and really make it such that you can then sell it off for housing projects. And is one of the potentials where we're looking into. But the problem is, why is limited space available? The space is limited. What is limited? And what has become more expensive also? In Vienna, the house price has tripled over the past 20 years, no? Even though the social housing is famous, right? So, but what has tripled in Vienna? It's not the houses that increased in price, not the buildings, it's the land under it, right? It's land that is limited, indeed. And one way is to, as said, make it easier to open unused land. But another way to open unused land more easily is by taxing unused land. So land value taxation for land value taxation, or also housing taxation, could be structured such that primary residences do not carry any burden. But we need to find ways in order to create incentives for people that have unused land or secondary residences to employ them better and provide them better into the city. We have limited land, so therefore we have an allocation issue. So it's not just about putting more money into the city, which is needed, right? But it's also about getting the funding, and the funding should be by those people who hold all the square meters that are not used.
Thank you very much. Maybe very briefly, another question from our audience, of course. Are there good practices at local level tackling solutions for housing development in a context of stricter land use regulations when a limited space is available? Does anybody know of a good practice? We've heard about the Prague and Vienna, of course, but with limited space available, maybe something comes up to mind?
I mean, there are a number of good practices. Actually, we are starting a study now where we're going to look at different European cities specifically under this lens. I think it really depends. It's always difficult to say what a good practice is because almost all practices have downsides on one or the other side. So, for example, if you now take, again, the example of Vienna, but we've seen this across Europe, is that many cities really tried to go into further heights. And indeed, that does help to increase the housing offer, but it does also mean that specific parts of the city suddenly experience much more shadowing, so the quality of life is going down. So yes, there are good practices in terms of overall impact on this specific policy goal, but it also leads to some, let's say, other effects that we might have not wanted. So in that sense, I would suggest there's always both sides. The most important has always indeed been the particular use of brownfield site, and what is happening right now is that there's a lot of research going into how we can use office space, empty office spaces for housing, because every architect, a student even, will tell you, oh no, not this question again, because, you know, it's not so easy. We can't just convert an office building into an apartment flat. You know, just think about where the water pipes are. And, you know, you want a shower, you don't, if you want it actually as an apartment, not student housing. So what we've seen is that student housing has been built in office buildings because then you can offer a shared bathroom. But for flats, we don't really aspire to that in most of the cases. But this is something where we can think around the reuse of specific areas in a city, and where potentially even one might think about some more harsher solutions in really rededicating some of the areas to housing rather than office space. In some cities we see a substantial part where office buildings are most of the empty vacancies. So because that's another question that's quite often being asked, what can we do to actually take vacant apartments off the market? Why are they empty? Of course, there are some cities, and we're looking into this as part of the case studies as well, is where speculation is a reason, and that's the proclaimed main reason for why some of the apartments are empty. Others are really just because someone keeps an apartment empty for their nephew to study, but the sizable number of empty spaces is not necessarily individual flats, it is office flats. Not office flats, office buildings. And that is also a topic that needs tackling. And we can see that, for example, Munich is currently working around that question. Berlin is going to work around this question. So a lot of these big cities have started to rethink this as part of a, maybe we shouldn't then say brownfield development, but a redevelopment as well within a city.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of our speakers today and to you, our audience, for all of your questions. Before we close, I strongly encourage you all to stay connected with ESPON and the Housing for All project. The project is producing new evidence to support policies aimed at delivering more affordable housing across Europe. The final results of the project will be available by summer 2025, and I urge you to follow their updates to stay informed and engaged with this ESPON activity. Thank you for being here with us. Goodbye.